Hello, everyone. I'm Melory Johnson, 25-year beauty veteran, consultant, and strategist. Welcome to Pretty Equity, where we tackle the real issues behind beauty investing and brand building and bring you the answers from the experts behind the deals. Today, we're talking about something that's often romanticized but rarely understood: formulation. A formula isn't just a creative idea. It's a technical, operational, and financial decision that affects everything from manufacturing to scalability to brand trust. So, joining me today to discuss it all is Mark Broussard, a cosmetic chemist who understands formulation and not just on paper, in the real world. Today, we're unpacking why not all formulas are created equal and why that matters more than most people realize. But before we get started, let's just unpack what a formula really is. Formulation is often treated like a creative exercise, or worse, like some kind of secret recipe. But in reality, it's one of the most operationally consequential decisions a brand will ever make, and one that ripples through the manufacturing, quality, cost, and scalability. Mark, thank you for being here. You've worked with formulas at every stage, from early concept to scale up and commercial production. So, for someone who's never stepped into our world and who thinks that a formula is just a recipe, how would you explain what a formula actually represents in practice beyond what's on paper? But before you answer that, just a quick note to viewers. Not all formulas are created equal. And I don't mean that from an ingredient standpoint alone. But Mark, you can unpack more of that in detail in your response. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yeah, the formula is the core of how your product communicates to the consumer and the consumer experience. You always start off with a creative idea, formula on paper, and you have technical considerations to it. And my favorite saying is every formula is perfect on paper until you actually try to make it. And I think that brings home what you're getting at is you can put together your paper formula, and then when you start trying to make it to into a stable product that will perform and can go into manufacturing and scale up and in stability, that's where you start understanding the impact of the formula holistically. You start there, and then you're going to go through various iterations to perfect it. And that entire time, you're considering what's the cost. You can do the ingredient cost out up front. What are the proper percentages of the ingredients to include? Will they be effective? Will the past the epidermis is going to metabolize on the top of the skin, which affects the effectiveness of the product or the efficacy of the product. So you're going down this path where you're starting off with as much of this information up front as makes technical sense, right? Theoretical, technical sense, and then you're driving down into the practical. Um, so you can take, to your point, you can take a formula, and if you look at a list of ingredients, the deck, you can take exactly those same ingredients and create two completely different formulas out of it. So not every formula is created equal, and a lot of formulas when they are developed, one of the final stages is a quality control chemist taking a look at the formula, and he or she will be cutting back on this, cutting back on that, just reducing the amount of the ingredients included to reach a particular price point. So yeah, you can't really tell how potent a formula is or how effective a formula is from simply looking at the list of ingredients.
Okay. I mean, yes, that is exactly, the way things happen in the lab. It is not as simple as, following a recipe in a recipe book. So now that we've established that formulation is less about a recipe and more about how that recipe behaves under real world conditions, let's talk more about misconceptions. Specifically, what's the biggest misconception you see founders or even investors have about formulation when they're evaluating a product or a brand?
I think the biggest misconception is that they assume everything will work when it gets to the consumer and actually delivers performance. You cannot know that up front. I mean, you design for it, but until you actually test it, you really don't know what the performance is going to be. And if so an investor needs to look at it from that perspective of, okay, I'm investing in the development of a formula, the stability testing, the scale up, that final step of actually doing the kind of clinical level study to document the clinical efficacy is really kind of the end point to say, okay, now we're ready to go to market with this product. Until you do that, you're guessing. You know, it's an educated guess. You're putting together the formula the way you think it will deliver that performance, but you really don't know until you actually test it. The other thing that investors and people new to the industry really should be very cognizant of is that there's a really big difference between a consumer perception panel test and a clinical test. So, on a lot of websites, you'll see 93% felt their skin was smoother, 94% thought their wrinkles were reduced. Those are consumer perception tests, and that's just allowing a panel of consumers to apply the product, use it, and then give their feedback. There's no clinical data there saying it enhanced hydration or moisturization by 50%, which is measured with instrumentation, and that's pretty sophisticated testing. So that's one thing that people new to the industry and our investors need to understand the difference between those two. Now, consumer perception panel testing has its value because if that's what people feel about using a product, well, that's useful and valuable information. But it's not clinical information that you can use to make claims.
So in other words, what you're saying is it is the difference between an opinion versus science. One is
Correct.
just, here's a product to try, here's a list of answers. Because the thing is they're not actually giving you the full opinion, they're just answering the questions written on the page that they are supposed to follow. So, it's a yes or
Correct.
no. Did this feel better? Did this not feel better? But there's no actual way to prove that that product was doing, the job that we're saying or we're claiming that it's doing. But expanding on what you
Exactly.
just said, where do you see those misconceptions showing up later? Is during manufacturing, stability, cost? Another quick note, though, for viewers before you answer that, Mark. What Mark is about to talk about here is where formulation stops being creative and starts becoming operational. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yes, the first part of formulation is part creative, part science. Where it becomes operational is when you're moving on to the next step. You've put a formula together. You're going to do the cost out. You're going to do the stability. You're going to tech transfer to a contract manufacturer. They will start working on the scale up. At the same time, hopefully you're doing some type of clinical validation of the effectiveness of the product and developing your packaging and everything else. So the fail points are first of all in the stability testing. That's where you're most likely to observe, it's just not holding up under the stability conditions. The second trip point is the scale up by the contract manufacturer. That's where you're going to really come into situations where you're going to have to go back and figure out why is this formula not passing stability. So you'll have to reformulate. And at the contract manufacturer scale up stage, why is it not scaling up? It certainly happens that you have formulas that pass stability that don't scale up. It's very different making a formula at a lab bench, in 500 grams of product at a time and doing the stability on it, then going into a manufacturing situation where now you have, 1,000-gallon tanks and pumps and, all of that related equipment. So it could take some tweaking, a way to kind of lessen the risk of that at the formulation stage. And this why is the very initial formulation stage, you're factoring in all kinds of things. You're factoring in ingredients, ingredient costs, percentages, safety profile, um, and considering manufacturing and scale up. What is the manufacturing procedure? And the more simple your manufacturing procedure, the higher the likelihood that you're going to scale up properly without any issues. And then when you get to the contract manufacturer doing the scale up, um, when you're formulating from scratch, you don't know what equipment they're going to be using. So, you do it in a generalist sense. And then when it gets to the contract manufacturer, you're going to get down to the specifics of the equipment they're using in their plant. And they are going to modify that procedure to accommodate their manufacturing process, right? So until you pass, those are your two trip points, stability and scale up.
Absolutely. And, Mark, I like to call this the lab trap. And
Mhm.
I see it countless times with new to beauty investors, new to beauty founders who'll come to me, particularly investors who, want to put money in something. They've been given a prototype, they've been given a lab sample, they love it, they think it looks and feels great. So now they want to invest in this new product or this new brand. But as you just explained, and as we both know, it's not that simple because it works in the lab doesn't mean it's automatically should be given the green light. To be clear for viewers, trust me, it's not only newcomers that have this misconception. Just to what you were speaking about before, Mark, how often do you see formulas that look great in development, but honestly struggle when they leave the lab and enter real manufacturing conditions? Particularly since in development, it doesn't automatically mean success there is going to be success in production, as you just explained.
Yeah, it depends upon the product format, to be honest. So if you take a look at simple things like toners and just basically water and ingredients that don't you don't have to deal with um, uh, thickeners or modifiers or something like that, those generally go through without any issues. When you get into formulas that require emulsification and then you're adding, polymers and things of that nature, gelling polymers, if you're trying to get a cream gel type format for the sensorials, that's where you're going to run into more issues than with those simple formulas. But even something like a shampoo, right? The viscosity modifier that you use is going to have a huge influence on the stability of that product. So if you're trying to develop something, I always tell clients, don't try to be too natural for your own good. Because if you develop a shampoo and you're going to try and use xanthan gum as your thickener to try and stay really natural, you're going to get a gooey mess, and it might settle out over time. So, better to give yourself a yield in terms of your criteria, and use something that integrates easily and works easily, as opposed to trying to force something for honestly a perception of naturality that would make that much sense at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to actually get to that a little later in our conversation. But, while we're on this topic of, of fails and where things break, so we've spoken a little bit, about, manufacturing conditions and scale up and all the rest of that. But, from a chemist perspective, um, where do you see failures most commonly happen with formulas? Is it during scale up? Is it during manufacturing, stability, or consumer use? Where do you see the most common fails?
The most common fails are at stability, and then the scale up. The scale up probably being because stability is done in the lab. So that's, lab conditions, you can control it, it's very small. Your larger risk is at manufacturing scale up. That's where you'll generally run into some real problems because you're
Mm,
going from beakers to vats, right? And huge pumps. So that's generally where you're going to have the problem. Most contract manufacturers are are really quite good at working around it. But some formulas, for whatever reason, I've got one client, they could scale up to, 15 liters, but anything above 15 liters, they just could not manufacture the
mhm.
product. And no one could really figure out why. So those kinds of things do happen, and that's where you're really going to run into a problem that's going to force you to go back and start all over again.
Yeah. You know what? It's for the viewers and particularly those who are planning to invest, it's really important that you understand this, that not all formulas are scalable. So, before you go and put your money into this, have a really, really good conversation with the chemists, with your R&D lab, with your CM, and do your due diligence even if it requires some testing in advance. Because, once you begin and you're putting your money into this, to your point, Mark, you may only get to a certain number, a certain, literage, and then from there, it just doesn't work anymore. The other thing that I've
Yeah.
noticed, just from my own personal experience, another thing that becomes complicated are the ingredients themselves. And I'm not going to talk about the types of ingredients because we're going to get to that in a little bit. But what I'm saying is ingredient availability. Um, Sometimes formulas are so complicated and have so many ingredients. I was once working with a client who had this concept, and she had almost almost 100 ingredients. And the problem that,
Yeah.
we were trying to explain is it's not just how are you going to, first of all, we have to make this thing, right? You've given us a recipe, right? Right now we have to make it in the lab, then we have to scale it up. But what was concerning me most is the availability of those ingredients because
Hmm.
some of those ingredients are so rare or so uncommon that they actually need to be manufactured or made to order, which means that you can
Yes.
be looking at upward of 600 days just for an order. Now imagine what this must be doing to your ability to scale. And even if you could scale from a manufacturer's standpoint, can you scale from an ingredient availability standpoint? Because at some
Hmm.
point or another, you're going to stall. Because if you can have 100 ingredients, you may be able to easily get, I don't know, 30 of them. What about the rest? So, I don't know if you want to
Hmm.
respond to that before I move on to my next question.
Yeah, yeah, I do because it's a very important issue. Um, a lot of, first of all, investors and entrepreneurs need to understand there's a handful of cosmetic ingredients that actually work, that actually do something on the skin. the great majority of things, like I'm particularly not fond of plant extracts because they're so dilute that they won't do anything on the skin. And those are primarily label ingredients. So this is something that investors in particular need to understand. Looking at a proposed formula or a product, uh, is it laden with label ingredients that aren't going to work and just drive up the cost, but they support a marketing story? Uh, and the more ingredients you put in a formula, the higher the cost is going to be. And every ingredient has its own lead time in terms of delivery. So you're increasing the complexity of the manufacture of that product. You might have ingredients with 2 week lead times, you might have others with 14-week lead times, and then you get into made to order. So I'm working with a client right now, and we're trying to move forward, but one of the ingredients, the key ingredients, is made to order. So we have to wait until it's made to order, right? Until it's ready. So I formulate, and this is really good advice for everybody. I formulate in a minimalist fashion, and that is I take a look at each ingredient. I determine, does it perform? Is it going to deliver that performance? uh, is it necessary in the formula, and whittle it down to just what's required. Um, Lower cost, easier to control the delivery and the accessibility of the ingredients. And the formulas will perform because I'm generally using higher percentages of purified actives as opposed to a plant extract. So you can get away with 15 to 20 ingredients in a formula that will outperform a 35 ingredient formula at a lower cost. And that's really something to focus on.
No, it's absolutely, and I'm not even going to start in ingredient interaction because that's that's a conversation for another day, and that's a
Yes.
rabbit hole we can we can get very lost in. So let's just move on. So in my experience, again, founders often anchor their brands around a story and of something you just mentioned a second ago. And they anchor their brands around what they term their hero ingredient, which is really very much trend driven. But I think it's important for us to pause and make a clear distinction for the audience about ingredients versus execution. Exactly to your point, Mark. What I mean is that a lot of brands are built around a moment, like a key ingredient or even a claim. But from my experience, brands that last tend to build around performance, not trends. Again, in my opinion, those are factors that play fundamental roles in a product's longevity. I believe that a story around hero ingredients may attract a first purchase, but it's performance and consistency that will earn the second. So, from your perspective, Mark, as a chemist, what do you believe actually matters more in the long term, the key ingredients or how a formula is engineered and why? But very quickly for viewers, because as you can tell, I like interrupting Mark before he starts speaking. It's worth noting that I'm using the word key a lot. And you'll hear Mark refer to key ingredients. And what we're describing here is specifically ingredients around cosmetics. It's only when we talk about OTCs or drugs do we refer to ingredients as active. Anyway, just a side note, but go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, it's really comes down to the engineering of the formula. The thought that a quote unquote hero ingredient is going to do all the work in a formula is nonsensical. It's really all of the ingredients in the formula interacting uh, and affecting the biology in different ways, right? So if you want to stimulate elastin um, formation or collagen formation, there are certain peptides that you use in combination with niacinamide, in combination with other ingredients, because you understand what affects that biological pathway. Um, the concept of anchoring around a hero ingredient, I, I personally don't agree with that approach, because when you're looking at formulating a product, you start with business, brand, product, ingredients, effect, right? And if you're focusing on that one ingredient, it's a very myopic perspective, and you're hanging your hat on that ingredient being popular with consumers for having some longevity. If it's something like vitamin C, okay, fine, that's been well established. It's probably always going to be used. But I don't think that is a very smart approach. I think the better approach is, and the market has changed over the past 3, 4 years in that respect. Um, the better approach is focusing on holistically the formula and the effect it has on the skin. And that's what you want to be developing, and that's what you want to be marketing, as opposed to saying honey. Honey's our hero ingredient. You've got honey in everything. What's her name? Dr. Sturm puts porcelain in
Hmm.
everything.
Hmm.
It's in every single product. Um, so, I mean, you can do that, but you're, I think, limiting the longevity of your product and your product line because, things do come out of favor, or people just kind of maybe get bored with them and move on to the next thing. And new ingredients are coming out all the time. So there's always going to be the next hero ingredient. Um, and that doesn't mean you don't incorporate it into a product. It means you just don't focus on it as much as you do on the performance of the product and the effect on the skin.
Okay, so let's just stick with trends here for a second here and delve a little deeper. I think a conversation around trend pressure is relevant at this juncture, since I predict that certain trends are here to stay, especially as social media and other influences cause the public to grow more and more fearful of the idea of chemicals. And what I'm talking specifically about here are clean standards and what you mentioned a little earlier in the beginning, this all natural trend. It seems particularly relevant to me to talk about these trends now since I have you with me, Mark. And since so many
Mhm.
brands are removing or replacing key ingredients faster than they're thinking through their product's performance. But before we go any further, I do want to level set something for viewers who may be new to this space, specifically around clean beauty standards. It's imperative to understand that unlike regulated categories, there is no single universal definition of what clean actually means in beauty. And as so many people don't realize, clean standards are not purely science driven. They are typically set by retailers, brands, or other third parties and focus on what's excluded from a formula, not on how a formula or a product performs or holds up over time. In other words, clean standards are built around lists of what cannot be included in a product, not around the performance requirements of those ingredients. And trust me when I tell you, every day those lists get longer, leaving chemists with fewer
Mhm.
ingredients to choose from, but which are still expected to perform in the same high standards as those that are now showing up on the no-no lists. That's where free from claims come in. Brands feel pressure to remove certain ingredients to meet clean standards, even when those ingredients play an important role in things like stability, preservation, and yes, performance. A perfect example being parabens, but I want to dedicate that specific topic to another conversation. Anyway, while clean positioning may be a powerful marketing driver, it also introduces real formulation trade-offs. And those trade-offs don't always show up until a product is scaled, shipped, or used repeatedly by consumers. So, from your experience, Mark, When brands pursue clean or free from standards, how do those ingredient constraints affect formulation performance, stability, and long-term scalability? In other words, what are the effects of those trade-offs, and where do they manifest most over time?
hmm Yeah, as you know, I am a clean beauty chemist. I was practicing clean beauty well before there was even a term clean beauty. So, it's a formulating philosophy. And the way I look at it is all of the clean beauty standards are pretty much the same. Everyone thinks they're different and there's a lot of standards. And yes, they keep adding, we ban 2400, etc. But when you get into the clean standards, there's really about 50 ingredients that are common across all of the clean beauty standards. Um, the clean movement resulted in a lot of new ingredient development to try to replace the ones that were on the dirty list, the black list, the ban list. So from my perspective, that restraint or restriction stimulated a lot of thinking and development of new ingredients as replacements. Uh, and these are by and large, either biotech or biologically driven ingredient alternatives. Uh, the way I look at it is it worth the environmental damage collectively for people to use cyclic silicones in their hair so that their hair looks 2% better, you know? And it's no, it doesn't make sense. Why pollute the planet so your hair can look 2% better, right? So I come at it from that perspective. Now, all of the all of the chemicals on the ban list are allowed to be used in cosmetic products under the regulation. So as you said, this gets back to retailer developed standards. Um, but I think that whole movement actually is losing its steam, to be honest with you. I think consumers have moved beyond clean and they're now looking for performance within the context of clean, if that makes sense. Um, so anybody can claim clean. The only way to, as a consumer, to know you're truly purchasing something that's considered clean is if it bears the retailer seal. And that's specific to that retailer, but it really translates across most all of the retailers. So clean, I think, has served its purpose in terms of stimulating thought and stimulating innovation. But it is no longer a significant driver of consumer choice.
And it's glad we're having this conversation because there's a lot of back and forth with, the need for clean. And the way I see it, and I think that you and I are on the same page, the way I see it is that if a formula is created well, it's going to automatically be a good formula. It's going to automatically be safer and healthier and cleaner and all
Yes.
of these kinds of things because it's well formulated. So they will automatically fall under the healthier because that's where cleaner really came about. It was that I no longer want to be unhealthy to myself, unhealthy to the planet. Just I want everything all around to be safer, right? But as
Yes.
we've progressed with technology, you kind of realize that a well formulated product is already going to be a safer, healthier, more, just a more environmentally friendly product all around. Packaging being another conversation, but yeah. So clean standards to your point, I do believe we'll finally see the end of that trend. But
hmm
I do think though that if we can address just a trend that you and I actually landed up mentioning a little earlier, which often gets lumped into the clean conversation, and that's the all
Mhm.
natural conversation. Because from a scientific standpoint, natural doesn't always or automatically mean safer, effective, or more stable than synthetic, certainly. Many natural ingredients are complicated, they're variable, and they're sensitive to things like heat, light, microbial growth. And that variability can make it harder to achieve consistent performance from batch to batch. And
Yes.
it can introduce challenges around preservation, shelf life, scalability. So while natural might be pretty as a brand story, it also requires careful formulation testing and controls to ensure to ensure that products remain safe and perform as intended over time. With that said, there's also another cause of concern, at least to me, with regards to all natural, and that's a lot of all natural is driven by the idea that because it's from nature, it must automatically be
Mhm.
gentler or safer for the skin. But I know and you know that from a science, from a skin science standpoint, you can't actually match up the naturals when you putting them up against such well-studied synthetic ingredients that have been studied for things like irritation, sensitivity, long-term skin tolerance. I don't know if you want to react to all of that, but it is something that you and I had both mentioned earlier on in our conversation.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, there is a perception, and that was part of the drive in the clean beauty that things that, were evolved from nature were better for the skin because, the planet is a very smart, multifaceted organism, and everything's designed to work in sync. But sometimes, of course, humans experiment and you use things that were not designed to work in sync with you, but some other part of the ecosystem. So natural um, is there's a couple of aspects of natural. One, the products don't necessarily work that well. And yeah, it might be all from natural source, but do they have the right molecules to interact with the biology to stimulate collagen production, for instance, where the synthetic peptides are not natural, but they do that. They interact with the biology. So the way I like to formulate is I use a natural base and then I load in synthetic actives. The other part you brought up is if you take fragrance, let's talk about fragrance. Essential oils are a complex stew that can 300 individual compounds, and it changes season by season, depending upon the rainfall, the sunshine, etc. It's not always going to be exactly the same, and you don't have any control over the composition. If you go to a synthetic fragrance, you can very precisely control the composition of that fragrance. It's repeatable, so every time you use it, you're going to get the exact same scent. Um, and you can better understand the toxicological effect of the components because they're purified. Whereas with an essential oil, it's purified. It will change from season to season. And they're also can induce phototoxicity. So, the concept that natural is better or is always better is not the case. Sometimes you're a lot better off mixing natural and synthetics. And the nice thing about using synthetics is you have that regulated or very well-known purity level and repeatability. And every time you get a batch, you just test it, to make sure it conforms, and you know exactly what you're working with. You can control the loading of each component in the formula. Do that with natural.
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, natural, it's a complicated topic. It's also a very emotional topic. People get very emotionally tied to, to the formulas. But what concerns me with certain of the naturals is that you are introducing unintentionally, obviously, skin sensitivity risk, you know,
Yes.
and those are the other things that, formulators, founders need to consider when they're formulating or when they're coming up with a concept, an all natural concept, because you know these kinds of issues can show up later. And I don't know how that tends to show up, whether it's through consumer feedback, complaints, the need for additional testing or safeguards. I mean, to be clear for the audience, by no means are either of us saying that natural is bad. That's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is that naturals just requires more engineering, testing, controls, guardrails. You know, it isn't a this isn't a conversation about natural versus synthetic. One's good, one's bad, one's good. It's just about how to formulate and how to understand formulation, how to understand engineering and testing, and how to make sure that if you are going to go down this road, that you know what you're getting yourself into and that you can prepare yourself for the real world. So, Mark, I don't know if
Mhm.
you want to react to that.
Yeah, I do actually. As I said earlier, I usually advise clients don't be too natural for your own good, because natural formulating can be more difficult. It introduces more risk. You have more variability because you don't have standardization of the ingredients that you are incorporating. And, it introduces really a batch to batch risk depending upon your sourcing of your ingredients. So that's why I like to balance the two. Um, natural, natural, quote, all natural certainly has its place in the marketplace. There are consumers, and that's just what they like. That's their ethos. That's what they believe. As an investor, um, I would not recommend going down that route. I think your best approach is develop the best performing product that you possibly can, get it out in the marketplace, and don't really worry about is it all natural? Is it clean? Is it this or that? Just focus on that performance. If you focus on performance, you're going to have a better chance of having a winning product and a winning brand than if you put all of these other obstacles in your way that introduce more risk into the formulation of the product.
And I'm glad you brought up the word risk, Mark, because I want to actually pivot here and talk a little bit about business and in particular business risk. And
Mhm.
so great segue, thank you. Because this is the part where formulation stops being creative and becomes financial. Because if an
Yeah.
investor is evaluating a brand, from your perspective, what formulation related risks should they be thinking about, even if the product is already on the market?
Oh, I would say the formulation risk it breaks down into a couple of factors. We touched on it earlier in the conversation, and that is ingredient availability and ingredient lead time. If you are working with an ingredient that is sole source, there's only one supplier. You're again now adding risk, factoring risk into the equation. You're adding risk if that supplier is unable to deliver, if that supplier goes out of business, if that supplier, for whatever reason, has some issues accessing from international markets some component that they require. That is something to try to avoid. In many cases, however, the proprietary ingredient is single source. It's a company that's, maybe new to the ingredient supplier component of the market, but they have performance data that makes it very compelling to take that risk. Um, Generally, you'll always look for uh, in formulating, you'll have this in your mind, or their backup suppliers in the event that we need to switch because something happened with our primary supplier. Um, there are, cost factors, lead time factors that all factor into it. So I do use some sole source suppliers because I work with a lot of companies that are bringing new biotech derived ingredients to the marketplace, and they have done the testing, and there's good performance data. But that's a risk that my client is seeking, and we try and minimize that risk at every possible avenue. But it's just if you want high performing products, sometimes you just have to take that risk.
Yeah, no, understood. And you know what, let's continue down this road of cost supply chain scalability because in my experience, formulation decisions don't just affect cost. They can quietly kill a new product before it even reaches production. So from your experience, how do formulation decisions affect things like cost of goods? And I know that we've touched a bit on this. But like I said, things like cost of goods, raw material sourcing, supply chain resilience, especially when those decisions are made without thinking seriously about scale. And forgive me, I know that we have touched a bit on this, but I don't know if there was anything extra you wanted to add.
Yeah, there's one thing, with the tariffs kicking in, et cetera, you've seen, um, a lengthening of the lead times on ingredients that are manufactured, in China, or Korea, that now have to be imported into the United States. So that certainly has happened. I had, one client, we were working with a surfactant, and the lead time increased from like 8 weeks to 14 weeks, and the price doubled. And this is within the past year. So what we had to do is basically create our own. I got the composition statement from the manufacturer that gives you ranges of the components, and we just purchased the components individually and made our own replica of the surfactant. Surfactants are very forgiving, so if you're off here and there 5%, it's not going to really make that much of a difference in terms of the performance of the end product. But yeah, you try to source. I try to source from within the United States as much as I possibly can. What you don't know is even though you're dealing with a U.S. distributor or U.S. manufacturer, where is that ingredient actually manufactured? It may be at a plant in China, and you presume that since you're working with a U.S. based supplier, manufacturing company, that it may be made in the United States, but that's probably not the case for the great majority of ingredients. So that's a risk factor. Uh, you know, um, Going with single source or sole suppliers, and then having to import from overseas, or two things that you want to avoid. But sometimes, like I said, if you want to differentiate your products and get the performance, you're going to have to take a chance on those sole suppliers of unique ingredients.
No, absolutely. And I mean, there are ways, mitigate or at least try to manage those risks.
Hmm.
But moving on to a slightly different topic. We've both seen situations where chemists will literally say yes to anything a client asks for. No challenging, no taking into account the brand or whether the request makes any sense from a performance sourcing or scalability standpoint. To your point earlier, sometimes people will want, a founder will want a formulation that's just so ridiculous on paper and that makes no sense from a biology and a, skin science standpoint that you're looking at this going, huh? But you know,
Mhm.
sometimes, you'll get chemists and labs where their sole, their business model is say yes to everything. Just give the client what they want. That's it. Just give them what they want. And, I I see that as a risk for brands.
Yes, it is. And, as a chemist, you want your client to succeed. You take some pride in the products that you're developing, and they're getting out into the marketplace, and you want to see those 4 and 5 star Google reviews and user-generated content on the effectiveness of the product. So generally, if a client comes to you with an idea, uh, some come with, I want these ingredients in the formula. Some comes with, a more broad, generalized concept. I spend time going through with the client to kind of filter the ingredient direction, right? The ingredients that are going to be going into the product, because there are some things that they may not have thought of that I know will help improve the performance of the product. And there are some things that they have thought of that they initially request that you just, pull. It's like this isn't going to do anything. So it's very important to have that conversation with the client to come up with the best formula you possibly can, the most effective formula you possibly can. And, with some give and take and explaining and everything else, most people come around. But what really drives people more than anything is money. And it's like, okay, if you can purchase this and include it in the formula, but it's not going to do anything. So why spend the money to do that? And that's what you're factoring efficacy, cost, balancing everything to make sure that the formula is efficacious. And at the end of the day, it's like, look, what you're proposing is not going to work. It's going to fail. So why even put it out in the marketplace to begin with?
No,
And you
absolutely.
just have to be very, yeah, you have to be frank and honest about it. I mean, I've developed 600 products. I can tell you what's going to work and what's not going to work. So, listen to me. But again, you get into, what's the story and all that kind of stuff, and that sometimes drives some decisions. But a story, a fairy tale is a story. You can always make up a different story, right? You know this all too well. You just make up a different story, right?
Yeah, it's just marketing, but
Yeah.
it's carry on. Were you gonna say something?
Oh, no, 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 no. It's just, it sometimes it takes some coming around to it because people come up with ideas and they get attached to them.
Yeah, no,
Uh,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
But it's funny that you meant we talk about all of this, and I just call them it's just sloppy formulating. You know what I mean? When you really
Yeah,
put no
yeah.
effort into it, and you're just you're given a list of ingredients, you throw them together, you make sure that they pass stability, and beyond that, as far as you're
Yes.
concerned, that's not your problem. I just call that sloppy formulating. But for those
Yes.
founders and investors watching this, um, when you get a sloppy formulator or sloppy formulations, I mean, these don't just increase cost, they introduce uncertainty. They introduce delays,
Hmm.
long-term risk, and those are the kinds of things that you may not see until it's too late. This is why Mark and I are having this conversation to really underscore how important it is to choose the right partners, whether it's an R&D or a CM. Not just someone who will blindly say yes and execute every request that you give them. I would prefer that you find a partner who's willing to challenge you and challenge your requests. With that said, Mark, from your perspective, what should founders or investors be looking for when they're looking at R&Ds to partner with? Especially if they're looking to avoid pitfalls. What are the questions they should be asking the lab before they commit?
Sure. The first thing they should be looking at is, in an R&D partner, the experience base, the number of products developed. Then that gives you some idea of the breadth of expertise in terms of formulating. Have their products won any awards? Although that's a double-edged sword because a lot of awards can be purchased. Uh, but look at the brands, look at the brands that they have developed for, and how are those products perceived in the market by consumers, right? The chemist can't control how effective the marketing is, uh, so you can't uh, kind of pin that on the chemist, so to speak, that yeah, these are great products, but the brand didn't take off. It could be it could be just bad marketing. But if those consumer reviews are up in the 4 and 5 stars, you know you're working with someone who develops products that consumers like, right, and appreciate using. So those, I think, are the key metrics to look for in terms of an R&D partner. Uh, and it's important also to take a look at how unique are their formulas. That gives you some idea of the breadth of ingredients that they work with and understand those ingredient combinations in terms of the effectiveness of the formula. Getting to that point, I had a, a consultant that I work with who decided to have her client's product manufactured by a contract manufacturer. And they weren't getting what they were looking for. So she came back to me and said, Mark, can you take a look at this and figure it out and advise us? So I said, okay, well, fine. I broke down the formula and I told her, I said, look, they produced a real lazy formula for you, which you described as sloppy. Okay. It looked great on paper, right? The ingredient deck looked great. It was a lazy formula. Everything you could tell was included at the minimum amount. And that's the contract manufacturer developing so that they maximize their profit, right? Because this was like PDRN and, some other ingredients that command higher price. And that's something you really need to be working with a chemist who knows how to break down, if you're in that situation, break down those formulas to understand, is this a sloppy formula? Is it a lazy formula? Are they relying on the 1% rule to make this formula look really robust, but it's not. It's not going to perform. So those are the factors at step one. Step two is I have a constellation of contract manufacturers that I work with, and over many years, I have curated that group of contract manufacturers. And that's something that's really important because we have nailed down the tech transfer, one. Two, the contract manufacturers that I work with and I recommend my clients work with understand that you don't change my formulas, right? Here's the formula, you price it out exactly what I've used. Do not switch suppliers because some ingredients you can switch suppliers to lower the cost, no problem. Others will affect the performance. So there are some ingredients that I'm very, very particular about supplier switching. Same NC, same ingredient, different performance. Um, and that takes time to develop that network. But once you have that network in place, things flow very smoothly. So if as an investor and a brand or an entrepreneur, one thing I would ask of the cosmetic chemist doing your R&D is what contract manufacturers do you work with? What brands, if they can divulge that information, are currently manufacturing with them. And then when they do their reference checking, they're reference checking how do you like working with him as a chemist, development chemist, and are you happy with the contract manufacturer? And now you have closed the loop completely around what it's going to take to get you to market.
Absolutely. You know, when you choose any partner, the right R&D partner, for example, it's more than just the formula you're developing. That partnership is going to determine whether your formula, your product can survive
Yes.
in the real world. In other words, once
Yes.
you've chosen the right partner and locked a formula, the next question becomes whether that formula can actually perform outside the lab at scale in real
Yes.
factories and under real world conditions. This is where the rubber
Yes.
meets the road and where theory meets reality, which brings us into what happens next, as you started mentioning before, when a formula leaves the lab and starts entering the manufacturing plant. How important is it that a formula be designed with manufacturing in mind? And what happens when it isn't? And I know that we have touched on it, and I know you did speak a little bit about this, but is there something that you would like to expand on now that we're back on the topic of contract manufacturing?
Yeah, you really do need to develop the formula with scale manufacturing in mind. And if you don't, when you try to transition that formula to the contract manufacturer, they simply won't touch it. If the manufacturing procedure is too loopy or unorthodox, they're just not going to want to get into that. So that is a critical component of developing the formula or ingredients, performance, manufacturability, stability, all factors that you're considering. So you have
Yeah,
to. There's no
no,
point
absolutely.
there.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
another thing, Mark, that I've found, from my experiences is that not all contract manufacturers are good at tech transfers. You know what I mean? That's just a reality. Not all of them can do tech
Yes.
transfers or can do them well.
Yes. And that I'll answer that in the form of a story. I had a client. I developed a line of products for him, and I recommended contract manufacturers that I work with that I knew could do a good job for him. He kind of was like a control freak, right? So everything had to be his way, and he siloed off everything. These were cosmetic products. He ended up selecting a color cosmetic manufacturer with not much experience in skincare. Well, color cosmetics like lipsticks and eyeshadows and, foundations, that's very, very different than skincare. So we got into it, and, they weren't producing samples that matched my samples. And the client was not happy with them. And they kept coming back to me, what's going on? What's going on? Well, I don't know what's going on. I mean, you pick somebody who's a lipstick manufacturer for your facial serums. So it got down to, um, well, how the the their list of ingredients and the suppliers, because nothing here is making sense. And when I got it, they had substituted 50% of the ingredient suppliers. And it's like, well, gee, no wonder, they're trying to manufacture something completely different in that context that I developed. And that's why I'm very insistent now when it goes over to a contract manufacturer, don't change the suppliers. If you want to change the supplier, ask me and I'll tell you, yeah, that ingredient, no problem. This ingredient, no, you have to go with the supplier that I used. So you run into those kinds of issues where some contract manufacturers will get a formula developed by a chemist, but then they're immediately making all of these changes. And, you just can get away with that in a simple formula. But when your formulas get more complex, it just does not work. So that's where you'll run into a lot of friction with the contract manufacturers. It's not a seamless flow through from development to manufacturing.
Yeah, and I mean, reformulation isn't as easy as it sounds because, you know, from a reformulation standpoint, and actually, before I finish that thought, I just want to throw something out to our viewers. Because reformulation means different things depending on where a brand is in its life cycle. So, what I mean is for established brands, reformulation can be intentional and strategic, driven by innovation, updated regulation, long-term growth. But for new brands or products at the launch stage, reformulation is rarely strategic. It's usually reactive, corrective, but it's also time-consuming and expensive. Reformulating at the early stage means redoing development work, repeating stability and safety testing, reassessing regulatory compliance, revalidating manufacturing processes, and often reworking the packaging, all of which cost time, money, and momentum. And that's why my advice is to get it right the first time. Formulate with regulatory requirements, target markets, ingredient and component availability, as we've been discussing, scalability, and packaging compatibility in mind from day one. Early
Yes.
formulation mistakes don't just waste your capital, they can erode investor confidence, delay growth before brand even gets a chance to succeed. With all that said, Mark, when reformulation becomes necessary early on, in other words, something like what you were just talking about now, we've gone to a manufacturer who absolutely can't do a tech transfer, so we're reacting to, something that has just occurred. What do normally see as the usual of what went wrong upstream, particularly
Yeah.
since we're talking about manufacturing. And in the same breath, what do you think can be done differently from a formulation engineering standpoint, from the CM's level? Because it's usually at this point where I hold my breath and go, yikes, here we go.
Yeah, where things usually go wrong is when the CM takes the formula, starts on it, may or may not make some changes, and some changes are to be expected for them to scale it up, right? You do your best as a development chemist to come up with a manufacturing procedure that makes sense going into a scale manufacturing level. But again, they may need to change it. They may need to change an order of addition or something of that nature. Where you generally run into problems is with the situation that I described, where a contract manufacturer takes a formula, substitutes out a lot of ingredient suppliers to use their stock ingredients, does not communicate that back to the chemist or get it pre-approved by the chemist or even just discuss it, and then moves off into making prototypes that the client is just not happy with. So it's really a matter of a failure to collaborate and a failure to communicate to ensure that everybody's on board, right? That's where I generally have the most problems with a tech transfer is where you just don't get the cooperation and collaboration from the contract manufacturer that you should. And they try to, uh, address the situation. But if they're not talking to you, it's like, don't ask me what they're doing. I have no idea. If they're changing things, they need to be communicating that to you.
Mm.
And that happens much more often than should, I'd say.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I've seen it myself. I've seen it myself,
Mhm.
look, as far as I'm concerned, the partnerships that you choose, um, whether they're R&D or CM are really, really important and need to be, thought out really carefully. And, I know this is logical. I know we've said it before, but do due diligence, please, people do due diligence.
Yes.
And that's
Yeah.
why we're having these conversations so that either if you don't know who to go to, reach out to us, reach out to Mark, reach out to me.
Yes.
We're
Exactly.
here. We're
Yes.
happy to answer your questions if you find yourself, running into a wall or you don't know how to take that first step. But let's just move on to evolution and longevity because we touched on it, a little bit earlier. And I think it's fair to say that great formulas don't just launch products, they support brands over time. Which brings me
Yes.
to my next question. And this is kind of a strange question, but I'm asking because I see this more often than I wish I did. But some formulas are just not flexible enough to evolve. And and just a quick food for thought for viewers. In the last episode I did of Pretty Equity, when I spoke to Andronik Avazian, he's a beauty strategist. He mentioned something that stuck with me, and he made an observation that basically what he said was that from an investor's perspective, formulas, products, brand stories can evolve. Um, Leadership that can't adapt often becomes the real constraint. In other words, great owners tend to matter more to investors than any single formula because formulas can change. You can reformulate.
Yep.
But the ability to pivot thoughtfully and at the right time is what ultimately allows a brand to survive. I don't know if you want to react to that, Mark, in terms of founders that you've worked with in the past. Because like you've said, and I think I said it before, people become emotionally attached to their formulas.
Yes. Yeah, I used to be in venture capital, and I am a member of Skin Angels, a dermatology investment group, and New Mexico Angels. And I'm experimenting with Bordy, which is an AI matching thing. So I always develop products from the perspective of uh, to build the brand, right? This company's going to need capital down the road. So let's make sure that I'm formulating products that are have legs, right? That you can build a brand around these formulas. And like I said earlier, business, brand, product, ingredients, getting down to that hero ingredient discussion. So you're taking a step back and looking at it from, is this investable? Now, a lot of firms that get into the beauty space uh, are not necessarily investable, meaning they may be too tied to their ideas to adapt as you need to. But this is a very rapidly changing industry, in particular over the past 5 years. So you have to be nimble. You have to be willing to cut products from the portfolio that do not meet your minimum performance criteria, even though you like it. It's just not doing you any good from a financial perspective in terms of building your business, building your brand. Um, so it really does take a certain detachment. And for a founder, you can surround yourselves with people who can help you navigate that detachment. But if you see someone who is just too um, emotionally tied to their product ideas and their actual products, you know you're going to have problems in terms of trying to raise and getting to open their eyes and realize it's a business, it's not a baby, right? It can it's something to make money. Yes, it's your idea, but at the end of the day, it's just a business. Um, so that involves having a founder with an open mind who will listen to who have been in the industry and can guide them in the right direction. And they just have to be flexible enough to not be so attached to anything that, it's a business. Now, if you want it to be just a lifestyle business with no investor interest and you're happy, making batches and selling them and they're exactly what you want to put out on the marketplace, there's nothing wrong with that by any stretch of the imagination. Uh, but you're gonna have a hard time building a real brand with some legs to it. And then that gets to your exit intentions. If you are happy with a lifestyle business, maybe you'll get lucky enough to sell it to someone at some point in time, and maybe when you reach a certain point, you just shut it down and the lifestyle's over. And you also get into now product longevity. And as I was saying earlier, the industry is changes so rapidly, so many new ingredients that getting back to reformulating, there may be something that comes onto the market that is a perfect new ingredient add to an existing product. And you have to be flexible enough to say, hey, we can make this product even better because there are new ingredients on the market that are going to enhance the performance.
Yeah, and that's
Um,
exactly, Mark, that's exactly
so
what I meant by elastic. You know what I mean? Having a formula that's elastic.
yeah,
It's exactly that.
yes, yes, exactly, exactly. So from an investor perspective, you run into it all the time where founders just get really attached to their products and their ideas. In which case, as an investor, you're just going to move on to the next opportunity because there's no point in investing with a founder who does not have an open mind.
No, no, absolutely. And we've come to the end of our chat here. So, we're on the part where I ask you about, a piece of advice to founders. But I mean, you've just really given, I think the most fundamental piece of advice to founders, and that's just to remain open-minded and flexible. Like you said, don't be so emotionally attached. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that, but I think you gave some pretty good takeaways for founders there. From a
Uh,
formulation standpoint, play the long game, people.
exactly. And the other component there is choose your R&D partner carefully and try and leverage off of their established networks, right? As opposed to choosing an R&D partner and then like this client that I mentioned, going off and finding your own contract manufacturer and it's completely the wrong contract manufacturer for your product type, and you just wind up with a real mess on your hands.
Absolutely. And Mark, because I know you can speak to this, any last comments or takeaways you want to leave for investors looking to back a beauty brand?
Yes, if you're an investor, realize that just having a prototype is just the start. There's a whole lot of things that need to happen between having that prototype and making an investment decision based on the prototype and the founder, because you're investing in both. And then driving that through to the point where you've done the clinical trials, if you're going to do clinical trials to prove the efficacy of the product. So it's not as simple. Getting a product to market is not as simple as one may think. You do have some trip points that can occur along the way. Um, and that's something that an investor really needs to consider is getting through those, having the discipline to understand that you need to get through those trip points to get a product to market, and then you're going to require more capital actually to launch it in the market. And pay careful attention to the founder that you're not working with someone who is so enamored with their own ideas that they're resistant to change, resistant to fast action. Um, I think a lot of investors probably think investing in cosmetics is a much more simple decision than it really is, right? One, see if you can find something with a proprietary ingredient that affords you some IP protection. Make sure that the company is entering into well-defined market niches, and the more niche, the better for a new company entering into the market. Less competition, easier to find the consumers. You understand what unmet need you're bringing a solution to. So investing in cosmetics generally, if you're just, kind of broad anti-aging, that's a very risky proposition because there's just too much competition. You really want to focus on going down into the niches to enter into the marketplace.
Well, as you all just heard, a great formula can get a product to market, but a smart formula helps a brand last. Mark, thank you for breaking down the realities of formulation beyond buzzwords and into the decisions that actually impact brand performance, cost, and longevity. If this episode helped you think differently about formulation and brand strategy, please like the video, share it, and subscribe. I try to release new episodes weekly featuring experts who help founders and investors avoid costly mistakes. And of course, if you have any questions or topics you'd like me to cover next, please leave a comment. I'm Melory Johnson. Happy New Year to you all, and see you in 2026.